Dr. Ray, hello. Can you hear me, Dr. Ray? Dr. Ray, if you can hear me, if you could just give a thumbs up.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh,
fine.
good,
Can you hear me?
and we can hear you as well. Hello, nice to have you with us. I'm Kenneth Lyons, right? I'm the cantorial soloist here. Can, Dr. Ray, we're just going to have you hang tight for just a few minutes until 7 o'clock.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. I just wanted to make sure that the connection was good.
That's great, and we can see and hear you clearly, and we're looking very forward. So when Rabbi Gordon gives your intro, you'll know that we've started the program.
Okay, excellent. Very,
Thanks a
very
lot.
good.
Appreciate it.
Yes? Yes. Great. Oh, I can't. Okay. Yes? Yes. Great. Okay. Oh, I can't. Yes? Yes. Good evening and welcome, friends, to this annual guest scholar event hosted by Congregation Sukkot Shalom, First Congregational Church of Wilmette, Kenilworth Union Church, and the Presbyterian Church of Wilmette. Kenilworth Union Church. Okay, there's a delay. It is our honor tonight to welcome you back to our annual guest scholar series, which began in its inception during the space sharing partnership between Congregation Sukkot Shalom and First Congregational Church of Wilmette over 20 years ago when we were sharing the same building just around the corner elsewhere here in the village of Wilmette. Our first series of scholars came to educate us about the Dead Sea Scrolls in conjunction with the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibition at the Field Museum that year. Eric Myers, Jim Vanderkam, and Jody Magnus joined us. And from that point, we inaugurated an annual lecture to bring in a scholar or popular author to talk to us about matters of faith and public conscience. And through the years, we have featured such scholars as Thomas Cahill, James Carroll, Susanna Heschel, A.J. Levine, Bruce Feiler, Rachel Mikva, Paula Friedrichsen, and others. The Presbyterian Church of Wilmette and Kenilworth Union Church joined us as sponsors and conversation partners. And tonight, our scholar event honors our friend and colleague, Rabbi Samuel Gordon, who is retiring from his rabbinate here at Congregation Sukkot Shalom this coming June 2022. Rabbi Gordon is the founding rabbi of the congregation, served in other congregations throughout the Chicago area, has been on the board of the United States Holocaust Museum, and has been active in the work of racial justice here in Chicago, primarily with the Rainbow Push Coalition, as well as in other work. So it is fitting tonight that our guest scholar, whom we invite to help us celebrate Rabbi Gordon's retirement, is a scholar of race and theology in the United Church of Christ, my home denomination. It is a privilege tonight to host Reverend Dr. Stephen Ray and to have Rabbi Gordon tell us more about his esteemed academic and pastoral careers.
We are indeed honored to have Dr. Ray join us here this evening. Dr. Ray is immediate past president of Chicago Theological Seminary, the UCC Seminary in Hyde Park. He is, as Reverend Perdue said, a scholar of the African American theological experience in America. He is a leader in the intersection of theology and social justice. He's the president of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Personally, it means a lot to me that he is here. We have worked for a number of years on that intersection of social justice from the mainstream Protestant world, the African American religious world, and the Jewish community. I've learned a great deal from him. One of the key pieces, I don't want to presume the lecture, however, is how the dehumanization of the African American experience was a model for the dehumanization by the Nazis of the Jews and others. Dr. Ray received his PhD in religious studies and African American studies from Yale University, his master's in divinity from Yale, his BS at Charter Oak State College in Connecticut, and a certificate from Hartford Seminary in the Black Minister's Certificate. He has been an important scholar and leader, and it is very fitting that during this time that we find ourselves in the challenges going on right now in our nation, that we turn to Dr. Ray for an understanding of where we move forward at this time. So, Stephen, welcome to Sukkot Shalom, to First Congregational Church of Wilmette, to Kenilworth Union Church, and First Presbyterian Church. We turn to you and ask you to lead us in our increasing knowledge and awareness. We're honored that you're here.
Well, thank you so much for the kind and generous invitation. I really consider it an honor not just to be with you on the occasion of this lecture, but also to celebrate the important and significant work that you've done, Rabbi Gordon. Now, I'm going to be clear and say that, Sam, you know I think the world of you because this is the first time I've worn a tie since I retired. But I wore one for you this evening. So once again, thank you, my friend, for your friendship, for what I've learned from you, and for all of the good work that you've done. So tonight, what I want to spend a bit of time talking with you all about is what I believe is the most pressing question and issue before us, and that is the issue of ecological collapse that seems that it will be imminent within the next several decades. Do we not take action against it? And I specifically want to approach the question from the issue of racial justice and from the issue of how it is that that intersects with public policy. So I want to begin my lecture by asking the question, is white fragility worth the possibility that your great-grandchildren will be among the last humans to stride on this planet? I begin with this rather provocative question to intersect two inescapable realities with which we live that have serious consequence for how our descendants will live if they live at all. Those realities are that we live on a planet whose ecosystem is rapidly changing in ways that may render our form of life unsustainable. One of the things that you may recall from high school when you were studying world history, if you looked at geography or what have you, there have been at least 5, perhaps 6 other occasions on the life of this planet where nearly 90% of the forms of life that existed at that time simply passed away. And the thing about it is that when we talk about the kind of ecological collapse that leads to this sort of mass extinction, it generally happens very quickly. So it gains steam very slowly, but once the actual collapse begins, it happens very quickly. So what I want to suggest is that that is the first of the realities that we're dealing with. And the second, which I think confounds it a bit, is that the reigning epistemological regime around which all of our material, economic, and cultural resources are ordered is a fictive category, which as a political discourse has little positive import. Now, I threw that sentence in because many years ago, my wife told me that you have to have one of those sentences in all of your lectures. That way they'll believe what's on your bio. So there's my 75-cent sentence for you. But let me put it another way more plainly. The two most urgent issues facing us as a species are that we live on a planet that is on fire, in a conflagration in which all may be consumed, and the primary way that we have for thinking about ourselves through the category of race resist the type of species-level imagination that may be our only salvation. Some of you may remember a movie a few years back, and the title of the movie was Interstellar. And what it was about was what happened when we began thinking on a species level. Well, the problem is that we are not there yet, but that's going to be what's required to save us. Or to put it even more plainly, to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., in a time of lethal global warming, racism, at least for humans, may well be a sickness unto death. Now, tonight, I want to engage these two intersecting realities specifically through the lens of public policy. And the reason I want to do that is because I was persuaded in listening to a presentation a few weeks ago that we have gotten beyond the point where individual interventions are going to make a significant and substantial enough difference to actually change the path that we're on. That we have got to, people who are concerned about a future for our great-grandchildren and our species, have got to be concerned on a public policy level, because that is the only level at which we can mobilize enough forces and enough of the kind of material resources that we have to make a substantial difference. So I'm specifically wanting then to engage these two intersecting realities. The one, the reality of what's happening with our ecological collapse, and two, the way that our way of thinking about the world in a racialized form is actually confounding our capacity to work on that. But the lens I want to deal with it through is public policy. Now, there are other lenses that you can certainly deal with it. We can talk about environmental racism. We can talk about a number of other ways that race and the fate of the planet intersect. But the one that I don't think nearly enough work has been done is in terms of how this contributes to our understanding of policy. Now, as a part of this engagement, I want to talk about the moral dimensions related to both of these issues in a way reframed by an accurate appreciation of the importance of American internal politics on the fate of the earth. So here, even though I'm speaking about a global reality, I want to focus very specifically on American internal politics. It is my hope that this reframing of the existential imperatives of our time will contribute to a greater clarity about how people of goodwill, religious and otherwise, ought to engage the social and political responsibility in these times. Now, recognizing the basic irresponsibility that infuses the current political discourse, I think, is significantly important. And what I mean by recognizing the basic irresponsibility that infuses our political discourse, what I mean is the underappreciation that what happens in the United States will affect the fate of the entire planet. And that's not trying to talk about American exceptionalism, nor is it trying to talk about any kind of jingoistic way of thinking about the importance of America simply because we are a beacon on a hill or any of that sort of thing. But rather, it is recognizing that because of the flow of history, the cultural and industrial power that we exercise in the world is crucial to the fate of the world. So my place to begin when I deal with this idea of irresponsibility is as a Christian theologian, an American public intellectual, and as a human concerned with the future of our species. And I want to begin by noting the particular way that these identities that I've just named for you constellate in material reality and the responsibility that attaches therefore. The first two, Christian and American, identify two of the most consequential ideological formations that have both shaped the material ordering of our world, which has brought us to the brink of catastrophe, and also the possibility of its avoidance. Now, I specifically lift up the idea of Christian, not to talk about it in a normative sort of way, but to talk about it in terms of our internal politics as a nation. So when we hear about evangelicals as a voting bloc and bring a kind of eschatological view that doesn't care whether or not the world burns, what we're talking about, from my perspective, a mistaken view, but clearly a view that emerges from the Christian community. So Christian and American become fused in such a way that it gridlocks any kind of public policy that we are able to bring about, because the ideas themselves, Christian and American, have become so impoverished by their union and by their fusion that they have very little creative to give to the conversation that we're having. So I think a part of what is necessary from my perspective is that we begin to do the work of disengaging that fusion. And if we're able to do that, I think we can open some new possibilities for thinking about what people of good faith and goodwill across religious belief are able to bring to the major issue facing our time. Now, the third one that I identify is the idea of myself being a human, concerned about our species. Now, that is the underdeveloped piece of our national discourse and our national politics, our ability to think of ourselves as simply human prior to and more consequentially than either of the other identities that we have. So that's the one that I think is the most significant for our survival. I'm just going to identify that now. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but I do want to note that. Now, I began with this quick reflection on identity as a basis for talking about what I've described as the political irresponsibility, because the two more significant ones, Christian and American, as I've suggested, have evolved in such a way that neither will explicitly recognize or claim adequate responsibility for the hand they have had in making the world as it is. So as a consequence, when we raise the question of how is it that we got to the point that we've gotten, neither the Christian faith nor American identity will own up to their role in it. And if you don't own up to your role in creating the situation, it becomes very difficult for you to own up to a role in saving the situation. Now, once again, I need to clarify. I'm not trying to make the idea of Christian and American normative. I'm simply doing a descriptive account of what's wrong with our politics. And I think that these two are the identities that are at work that impoverishes our capacity to engage in an internal politics that is able to operate on a species level for the benefit of the entire planet. So when we talk about those two, it is rather their all too human practice to create a reduced sphere of their confessed influence and consequence, usually a sphere that minimizes the shape and longevity of the harm they have done, whether that harm be the decimation of indigenous peoples or the imposition of economic regimes which privilege carbon and plastic-based industries across the globe. Anyone who is familiar with the period of modernity, which roughly runs from the mid-1600s on through the 20th century, and some would say even continues now, is that there's a significant way that religion and industry went hand in hand across the globe and did so in ways that reshaped the very material reality of the world in ways that created single crop economies incapable of feeding their own population, and also creating carbon-based industry as the only alternative for what we talked about was progress from the third world to an advanced first world status. Were we concerned with other nations, this recognition might not be as consequential to the future of our species. But as I've hoped to suggest, given the space, or rather the place and power of America, this irresponsibility is catastrophic. While I don't find the language of empire to be a helpful analytic because of its overuse in recent years, it is a helpful trope with which to look back on history and to see what I mean by political irresponsibility that has catastrophic consequences. A few years back, in fact, it wasn't long ago now, I went on a trip to Israel and to Palestine. And one of the things that I was struck by was once I came back and I read a few books, First and Second Kings and Psalms in particular, I recognized that the world that I was moving through bore very little physical resemblance to the world in which the writers of that text lived. So for instance, if you go, as many of you I'm sure have, on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, it's still a very winding road that takes you down through valleys and all of that. But the one thing you don't have to worry about are lions. You don't have to worry about too many bears jumping out in front of your truck. Nor, for that matter, do you have to worry about too many trees and vegetation. You see some here and there, but not the kind that was described by the writers of those books. Now, the reason why, there was a wonderful series on the documentary on the on the Roman games in the Colosseum. And one of the things that the researchers had discovered was that the Roman games and the various colosseums were the primary driving factor for the extinction of lions in Northern Africa and in Eastern Asia, the place we now call the Middle East. It was the primary cause for the denuding of the many forests that were in those places. And it went through another sort of analysis, but the point was that the operation of this empire had physically changed the very environment so that it no longer resembled what it had before the rise of that empire. And what I want to suggest this evening is that the United States of America has been a similar force in terms of the remapping and the reshaping of our planet, particularly in terms of issues having to do with climate and with issues having to do with ecological collapse. So, but most of us in the spheres in which we operate hear very little about the responsibility that comes with that legacy. We talk about it sometime, but we don't talk about it very often. So what I would argue is that that sort of denial is the type of denial of which I speak is found in the internal politics of our nation, and as a consequence is a contributing factor to paralyzing our nation from engaging in the kinds of policies that might actually change the trajectory that we find ourselves on. So I'm going to take a moment to talk about the internal politics of America and the moment. At present, we find that we are unable to mobilize sufficient public policy initiatives to reshape and reform our dependence on carbon and plastic-based industrial economies. This is largely the case because issues upon which our politics are currently focused are ones that deal with what I describe as the cultural, emotive dimensions of our common life. This is most plain in the irrationality of our government meeting with representatives from nations around the world about the future of our species, right? Because that's what the talks that were going on last week was about, the future of our species, yet we were faced with the irrationality that even though that consequential conversation was being had, our internal politics was focused on critical race theory and the content of public school curriculum. So sit with that for a moment, that we were actually having the leaders of nations from around the world talking about our survival as a species, and we were focused on critical race theory and public school curriculum. Not STEM education to train a generation of scientists to hasten the transition of our economy from carbon and plastic-based industries. That wasn't the conversation. But whether the book Beloved, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Toni Morrison, ought to be taught in our schools because of the discomfort it brings some white students and their parents. That was the center of our internal politics for the last few months. The irrationality of this moment is not new. At critical moments in the last few decades, when the specter of ecological collapse began to gain traction, an internal politics of racial distraction came to the fore to change the subject. There are some of you on this Zoom meeting and in the room old enough to remember the coincidence of the rise of the Southern strategy, which is a coded language to describe the politics of white racial grievance, at the same cultural moment in which Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was giving impetus to a modern environmental movement focused on industrial practices. And see, that's the key, right? Because what Rachel Carson did with Silent Spring was she wasn't talking about, well, if you garden and grow your own food, that will help the world if you cut down on beef production. No, she was specifically focused on industrial policy as an engine for the degradation of our environment. And lo and behold, what happens is the Southern strategy comes along and our politics begins to shift away from public policy that addresses the concerns that she raised to talk about how it is that we ought to have law and order, how it is that school systems ought to have freedom to discriminate. What the whole thing was, and I'm not saying that these were not important discussions. Don't hear me saying that at all. But it is to say that it's a coincidence that they come to the fore as a way of changing the subject from when we talk about environmental issues. We do well to recall the ways that the significant policy debates about dealing with historical structural inequities of America along lines of race came to the fore when the power of the government to enact policies like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Waterways Act were being challenged. The fights over affirmative action, occasioned by books like The Bell Curve, saturated our internal politics at the moment that the regime of deregulation was being put in place to blunt the growing policy awareness of the harms being caused by plastic producing industries. And what I'm trying to argue this evening is that I don't think that these were coincidental, right? I don't think that in terms of how it is that industry resisted effective public policy on behalf of the environment was something that just happened to coincide with stirring up a backlash against projects around racial justice. I think the two are very, very connected. And that's what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about. Because for those paying attention during these past few decades, it is not news that racial animus and insecurity are used as distractions. That's not news. But what I do want to suggest that may be new to some is the ways that this distraction has too often been used unnoticed to stymie effective public policies on matters related to ecosystems on which our species rely for our very existence. Or put another way, racial issues have been used to trump, if you will, environmental issues. Too often, those of a progressive bent have been overly focused on public policy related to taxes and related to labor, and not sufficiently related to matters having to do with the environment. Now, while these are of critical importance to the development and maintenance of a just and stable society, they will count for little in the face of ecological collapse. We are seeing this in the many refugee crises around the globe that are being occasioned by climate change. Because recall, as you're reading the newspaper and you see these crises emerging, a vast majority of them are being created by changing environments that can no longer sustain populations. So I want to shift now to talk a little bit about white fragility and the role of race in our internal politics to make this connection, sort of bring it to full circle. At this point, as we turn to the issue of white fragility and its deployment as a means of confounding effective use of public policy to deal with the ecological catastrophe in which we find ourselves. To do so, it is necessary to be explicit about the particular cultural conditions which create the space of its power. Primary among these is treating racism and racial inequality as issues having to do with the cultural, emotive dimensions of society, and only secondarily with the material distribution of social and economic goods within society. Approaching the struggle for racial justice using this cultural, emotive approach leads us to talk about things like goodness and badness, or things like hope and despair. And by putting it into that category, when we talk about how one is engaged in terms of matters of race, either it makes them a good person or a bad person, either it gives them hope to move on or despair in terms of where they're at. White fragility wholly exists as a response to the cultural emotive. Now, by this, I mean that it draws on the irrational for its grounding. Now, by irrational, I mean that there is no demonstration of material fact that is adequate to address it when engaged. So when white fragility begins to come to the fore and is evoked, there is no material proof that you can demonstrate that the basis for its existence is false because it operates wholly on this cultural emotive level that, as I've described it, is the irrational. Think about the entire debate around critical race theory. Even in their misnaming of the project, its opponents helpfully elucidate this point that I just made. As they frame the matter, they do not want the objective teaching of American history around issues of race. Because although it's news to some, slavery really did exist, whether you want to teach about it or not. Whether it's news to some, the Chinese Exclusion Act really did exist. The Japanese displacement really did exist, whether you want to teach about it or not. All of these things are objectively true. But the point is that what they are against is that teaching actual American history will make their children feel bad, feel ashamed of being white. That's the cultural emotive piece I'm talking about. More, it will leave them and their children with a cultural despair that the nation of which they had taught their children to take pride had a problematic history. So these are the issues that they had. Now, never mind that people of color have found a way to teach our children pride in our nation while telling the truth about our nation at the same time. So, it's not an either or proposition. But what we're seeing is when it's reduced to the cultural emotive, as I've been describing it, what ends up happening is that it becomes a powerful motivating force, but it's a motivating force against which facts are useless. White fragility, when invoked, displaces the possibility, and this is the key to connection to this lecture, of substantive policy engagement around much of anything. So what ends up happening is that because it doesn't really have a point, the only thing it does is paralyze. And it creates a kind of public policy paralysis. And particularly policy engagement with our ecological crisis. Note the results of the election in Virginia. At the same time, there was an international summit on the emerging climate catastrophe. So there's an international summit that's being reported on every single day, and it's being reported on in ways to try to help people understand we're talking about the future of our species. But because of the results of that election, and you remember the new governor of Virginia closed his campaign with an ad with a mother talking about how concerned she was that beloved was being taught in the public schools. That was his closing argument. So for at least the foreseeable future, Virginia will be able to do precious little on the level of public policy to address the ecological crisis about which I'm focusing this lecture. And if one is to pay attention to political commentators, those election results presage the next two election cycles. Now, if this should come to pass, for at least 4 years, and depending on the presidential results, could be a decade, we will make no meaningful progress in the area of public policy around issues of systemic ecological collapse. So what will have ended up happening is that race will have been used to blunt one of the most meaningful periods in time that we have to create a future for our species. Now, given the place of the United States, as I've suggested earlier, in the industrial and cultural economy of the world, this means that barring some major scientific breakthrough, the impending ecological collapse and attendant extinction event will likely be irreversible because one of the major nations that could have made a difference will have been unable to enact policy because we were continually talking about cultural emotive issues that at the end of the day do nothing to contribute to our future as a species. Now, should we lose 20 years to this policy paralysis, it is likely that a human born within the next decade will likely live to see a planet that is inhospitable to our species. Now, it is this reality that gave rise to the question which I began this presentation. Is white fragility worth the possibility that your great-grandchildren will be among the last humans to stride on the earth? Now, I did not come this evening to simply raise the alarm for people of goodwill. I do not think I would honor my friend, Rabbi Gordon, by doing so. I think I can honor him best by offering a word of hope in the midst of the challenges that we face. Now, I should be clear that I am a Calvinist Christian. So when I talk about hope, I have a very clear understanding of what that means. When I use the word hope, I am not talking primarily about something that I feel. I am talking about a way that you live in view of the world that you know ought to be. To wit, I offer a couple of ways to deal with white fragility as a tool continually deployed to confound the work of public policy that might yet save our species. Number one, treat issues of racial justice as an existential issue for our species and not a moral issue having its primary operation in the area of the cultural emotive, meaning address the issues as a public policy matter. This way of proceeding creates the possibility of building an enduring coalition that can break the policy paralysis that continually manufactured using an internal politics of racial grievance animated by malice. So if you begin to deal with matters of racial justice as a public policy matter and not as a matter of healing the human heart, there's a significant way that that has the power to build an enduring coalition that has the kind of electoral might that can ensure that public policy can be developed and continued, that will address the concern about our species and its continuance for centuries to come as opposed to decades to come. Number two, accept the responsibility that the internal politics which we will allow to be enlivened in the next few decades will likely decide the fate of our species. This is no time for wishful thinking. This is no time for us to think that this is overstatement. The evidence is clear that the decisions we make and the policies that we put in place over the next few decades, the next 2 decades, perhaps 3, will decide whether this planet will remain a hospitable place for our form of life, or will we become a part of the next great extinction event? Always ask yourself. Now, this is where I am going to turn to the personal and cultural emotive. Always ask of yourself and of other people of goodwill, are our politics contributing to a public policy and bringing it into being that will reshape the future and avoid the imminent ecological collapse and extinction event that includes our species. Because if our politics is not substantially focused on that, then it is not a politics worthy of the future that we want to give our descendants. 3, and I want you all to repeat this after me. And it's kind of hard to do on Zoom, but you can do it in your home, or you can do it there in temple. Think about your grandchildren and great-grandchildren in all of your politics. You've heard it now, so repeat after me. Think about your great-grandchildren and your grandchildren in all of your politics. The challenge for people of goodwill is to discover ways that the moral implications of racial justice can be addressed while yet keeping the necessity of policy interventions in view that deal with the ecological catastrophe we face. That is a challenge worthy of the event for which we are gathered this evening and to which we dedicate our lives, because that is a challenge that does honor to a good man who's done good work. So once again, thank you so much for this kind and generous opportunity to spend some time sharing some thoughts with you.
Stephen, thank you from the bottom of my heart. You have indeed honored me, but you've also challenged us. You have given us, provoked us in thinking, and thinking in new ways. I just want to focus on one area of concern that you brought up. I think it is inherent in your teaching as well. There is in the United States, at least, something unique in terms of that part of the faith community, the evangelical faith community, that has always been skeptical of science and has always rejected science. And it is part of what's going on in terms of the public schools, that the desire to not allow critical race theory to be in the public schools, the absurdity of that, because it isn't there anyway, but the shibboleth of the mask mandates and the yellow star being worn by those who object to that part of science as well. Genesis 1 is misquoted often about the role that humans have in terms of sovereignty over the earth, to do whatever we want with the earth. How do we move those who are more literalist in their reading of the text, the evangelical movement, which would reject science and is driving some of this reactionary move against the reality that we know, including the pandemic?
Well, I think, and that's why I chose my words very carefully when I talked about developing an enduring coalition that is dedicated to the future of our species, is that, to be honest with you, Rabbi Gordon, the time has passed to be worried about converting. We have to build a coalition that can use the democratic process of our nation to begin to turn the levers of public policy to ways that deal with, one, science-based ways of understanding the world, two, public policy that is related to the climate catastrophe that we're facing, and three, creates a more just society. I mean, one of the things that I've seen certainly in terms of the politics of our nation, is that the people who are reactionary and the people who are trying to bring about the antithesis of a creative future for us all have never been an electoral majority. I mean, they've not been an electoral majority since the 1950s. What has happened is that they've been able to continue to sustain a stable coalition that stands against science, that stands against facing moral responsibility, that stands against reordering the sort of industrial reality of our world so that it is not so reliant on carbon and plastic producing industries. They've never been a majority, but what's happened is that people of goodwill and a progressive vision in terms of thinking about how we move forward, we have always been an unstable majority. So the coalitions that we've been able to put together, we've not been able to sustain. And as I've tried to suggest this evening, one of the things that has worked to confound the maintenance of those coalitions that persist long enough to establish public policy to create a different world is by evoking white fragility. And so that's the entire piece of when I talk about white fragility, it is as it is used as a tool to ensure that even though we're talking about an electoral majority, it's very clear that it is an unstable majority. I mean, one of the things, if you followed our politics, particularly around the whole issue of voter fraud, there was a guy whose name was Van Sparsky, and he began his work in the late 1990s, and he began trying to convince Republican lawmakers, consultants, etc., Hans von Sparsky, that's what it is, that they would always be an electoral minority. And the only way they could remain power is by shrinking the electorate. And the way to shrink the electorate was through putting in place voter laws that restricted access to the polls, because it had become clear from the 1992 and 1996 elections that if they were able to ensure that it was an unstable majority, then they would always be able to maintain control of at least one of the houses of Congress, either the House of Representatives or the Senate and or the presidency. And remember, the basis for my talk this evening hasn't been bad public policy, it's been paralysis that creates no public policy that deals with issues having to do with climate and some of the other issues. So in answer to your question, I'm not about the work of conversion. I think at this point, the survival of our species depends on developing a sustainable coalition of people who are dedicated to a future, not just that we will exist, but that we will all have a share in the goodness of the world that exists, should we be successful in the maintenance of this planet as a space hospitable for our species.
Dr. Ray, it's Stephanie, and thank you so much. I always find learning from you and conversing with you sobering in the best way, focusing. I'm reminded of that scripture that God is not the author of confusion. Mm-hmm. And we have some Calvinists in the house tonight to keep you company. I'm one of them. I think I've got some colleagues here from Kenilworth Union Church and others likely on Zoom. But I'm also aware we have a Jewish audience as well, and so I resonated with and learned from your identification of yourself as a Calvinist Christian as you were talking about hope primarily not as a feeling, but as a kind of disposition. And I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little for us. I know we're talking about public policy, but in the realm of theology, that might be helpful for a few of our Christian friends and Jewish friends as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that question. So when I think about hope as living into the world as it ought to be, for me, hopelessness, by definition, is the acceptance of a world, the acceptance of a circumstance, the acceptance of a reality that suggests that this is all that there is and that this is all that there can be. And I begin to shape my life around that despair, as opposed to living into a reality. And what I mean by living into, once again, I'm not just talking about feelings. I'm not just talking about ways in which I'm thinking about something, but I mean actually materially living as if the world was a different place. One of the book that I read, I think that significantly shaped how I think about this, was written by Svetlana Todorov, and the book was Facing the Extreme. And what Todorov did in this particular work, he was a cultural anthropologist, a literary theorist. He looked at, and what he taught, and the subtitle of the book was The Moral Life in the Death Camps. And what he talked about and he focused on was how people, even in the midst of these camps, the people who didn't die immediately within the first 45 minutes of getting there, but the ones who were in the camps for a bit, how they kept their humanity alive by living as if their humanity mattered, even though everything in their world said that their humanity meant nothing. How they continued to live as if their lives meant something. How they continued to treat one another. Now, certainly there were those who became predatory, and there were those who lost hope, but they were not in the main. And so part of what I took from that book, and I also, having grown up in the place that I grew up, and I mean, I really came to understand as I got older, the world in which I grew up in was that I grew up in a part of Queens in New York City and went to the public schools in the 1960s and the 1970s. And even though people weren't talking about the Holocaust, these were Holocaust survivors. These were people who had been displaced persons in the 1940s, 50s, et cetera. And they were yet able to build. They taught me, they gave me hope, they taught me ways of being in the world. So these were people who had gone through the actual worst that humanity can inflict upon one, and they did not lose their humanity because through it all, they had continued to live in the world as it ought to be, and not the world as it is. So I say all of that to say, the content of hope for me then is not just thinking about in an ephemeral kind of way, but it is concretely living one's life in the way that the world ought to be. So, I mean, one of the things, and then I'll wait for the next question, but one of the ways that, I describe this is we live in a deeply flawed world, particularly along lines of race, particularly here in the United States. There have been many times in my career, because I've been in ministry now in the United Church of Christ, which is a predominantly white denomination. I've made my career in theological education since the mid-1990s. I've given my entire life to the building and the maintenance of predominantly white institutions. And I've done that because I know that even with the persistence of racism, even with the persistence of fragility, that there is a world that can be and that ought to be, and that working toward that world was worthy of my life's sacrifice. So that's why, when I talk about hope, I'm talking about actual decisions we're making about where we're going to live, where we're going to work, where we're going to worship, where we're going to be in the public square, who is going to be in our sphere, who is going to be able to be my friend because of all these other decisions that I've made. And that is living into the hope that at the end of the day, while we live in the midst of these inequities that are based on race, religion, ethnicity, that they do not have the final word. Because once we grant them the final word on our existence, that is when we then, I think, begin to talk about living in the midst of hopelessness.
Dr. Ray, hi. My name is Kenneth Lyons-Wright. I'm the cantorial soloist here at Sukkot Shalom, and I've been moderating the chat this evening. We do have a question from a congregant of ours. Eve Williams asks, how do those of us trying to promote teaching equitably refocus the community when many are distracting and distracted with arguments against teaching CRT, critical race theory? How do we build the coalition?
That's a very good question. And I think that the way that I would, there are two things in terms of building the coalition. Number one, make it clear that you're trying to build an enduring coalition. Because I think one of the problems is that often we have more allies than we know. We simply don't know that each other exists. So I think in a very public sort of way, be clear about the work that you're trying to do. And the second is do the work that you can do in the place that you are. Because beyond the fact that that's all you can do, one of the things that certainly my faith teaches me is that, or I take from my faith, is that we never know what God is going to do with our work and our actions. I always go back to the, and we talk about it so much that the sheer revelatory power of it is lost. That I am talking to you today largely because a woman who was tired said, I am not going to move today. I might move tomorrow. I might give up this seat next week, but I'm not going to move today. And the forces that unleashed within history changed the entire shape. Now, certainly it didn't make things perfect. Certainly it did not resolve anything finally, but when we're doing the work, we have to do the work of doing it, number one, so that we become visible and available to allies that we don't even know we have. And number two, we do so with faith that God does something. And frequently it is unexpected what it is that God does with what, and so I'm not going to try to tell you how God works. I've been alive long enough and in this business long enough. In fact, I often used to tell my classes I was going to write a book on systematic theology. And the title of the book was going to be, Who the Hell Knows? Because at the end of the day, in terms of how it is that God brings about what it is that God intends, who knows? The only thing we know is what we can do to try to be about that good work.
Dr. Ray, thank you so much for your time this evening. I will take away that admonition not to get distracted and to stay focused on the building of those coalitions, to examine my own fragility, and to ask whether it is indeed worth it, and the answer, of course, is no. Thank you for guiding us, and it has been my privilege, particularly as a kind of moderating presence here, to converse with you and to honor Rabbi Gordon and to be in the company of two men who I think so highly of, who have modeled for all of us this ability to build coalitions and work across barriers and not to become distracted, but to work as partners. So thank you for your time, for your scholarship, for your faith, and for your willingness to be here with us tonight in honor of Rabbi Gordon.
Thank you.
Stephen, thank you for being with us. You honored me. Thank all of you who are here in person and those of you who are joining us live stream. This has been challenging, insightful, inspiring, and you really have given us a great gift on this evening. I hope you're doing well in Maryland, and I hope we can see each other in person soon. Be well.
Indeed, indeed, my friend. Okay, so yeah, let's